Okay, we might get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on the summary of findings of the Scanlon Foundation Social Cohesion Survey for 2020. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we are all on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the Ngunnawal people whose land I am on here today in Canberra. I would now like to welcome and introduce our guest speaker for today, Andrew Markus, AO. Andrew is Emeritus Professor in Monash University's Faculty of Arts. Since 2004, he has been a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. His research specialisation is in the field of racial and ethnic relations, ethnic communities, and immigration policy. Andrew has extensive experience researching Australian public opinion, beginning in 1988, when he was commissioned to prepare a report on how Australians see each other for the Fitzgerald Committee on Immigration Policy. He is the senior researcher on the Scanlon Foundation Social Cohesion Survey, which has been conducted annually since 2009. So thank you so much for joining us today, Andrew, and really looking forward to hearing the summary of findings and hearing more from your knowledge and expertise. Thank you as well, everyone, for joining. There will be some time for questions at the end, so please feel free to send these questions through as the presentation is going on, either through the Q&A box or the chat box. And Andrew, I'll now pass over to you to commence.
Okay, thanks, Samantha, for that introduction. And hello, everybody. Great pleasure to be having the chance to discuss the survey findings with you. So before I start, I would also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners. I'm speaking from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to the traditional owners, past, present, and emerging. All right, so I'll share my screen with you and take you through this presentation. Where is the screen gone? Sorry, are you able to see that screen, Samantha?
Sorry, Andrew, no, not yet.
Okay.
There we go. You can see your Zoom screen now. So we can see what's on your laptop or computer.
Can you see now that?
Yes,
excellent.
We can see it now.
Makes it better. All right. So the Scanlon Foundation surveys annually since 2009, but there was an earlier one in 2007. So we've got this broad perspective going back to 2007, or we can just look at the last couple of years. And the point of looking at the last couple of years is it's a consistent survey methodology for the last 3 or 4 surveys. So that gives us that consistency. Or we can just look at what happens between July and November 2020. In 2020, there
You've just frozen a bit. Sorry, Andrew. Oh, we've just lost Andrew. Sorry, everyone. Andrew, you're back. You're just on mute. There we go.
Okay. I'll go back.
Perfect.
Samantha, is that all right now?
Yeah, we're back on. All
Okay,
good. Thanks, Andrew.
All right, so I was saying that there were three large surveys, three surveys, two large, one smaller one in the Chinese community, lots of questions, like more than 100 questions in the July survey. So really gives us like a 360-degree perspective on public opinion. Now, I make the point that this is not the only surveying out there, because sometimes people will say when I do these presentations, well, that's nice, but how do you know? How do we know that this is reliable? Is it just one survey? You can do another survey and get very different results. Well, there was quite a lot of surveying last year. The Lowy Institute poll, the Essential report comes out every 2 weeks, regular news poll, Big Health. So a number of surveys available. So we're able to benchmark the findings against these other surveys. What's distinctive about the Scanlon surveys is the breadth of the questionnaire, the size of the sample, which means we can look at subgroups. It's large enough to look at subgroups. We've got the context to evaluate the findings going back to 2007. And also what is distinctive is there's no other survey that has such a focus on immigration, ethnic, cultural diversity, and multiculturalism. So what happens then in 2020 with regard to this very difficult time in world history, and not least in Australia? Now, the Ipsos polling agency, which is an international polling agency, says that their finding indicates that there's no question that more cohesion was evident in societies in the early days of the pandemic, which they explain by saying that people will always, when there's a common enemy, come together. And in 2020, there was the dual enemy, health and economic problems. But they were finding late in their surveys that social cohesion was starting to fray as the pandemic evolved. And I think it's very evident, for example, in a number of European countries today, not everyone, but a number of countries. So did this happen in Australia? What are the broad indicators? And the broad indicators, as you would expect, is COVID-dominated thinking. 63% in July nominated COVID as the #1 issue. 15% indicated the economy, 5% climate change, then not much more. Interestingly, by November, the level of concern about COVID had actually gone down. You see, it's gone down from 63 to 32%, nominating it as the #1 issue. And this is how if we want to graph it, how it dominated thinking. This is an open-ended question, so people can nominate anything, but it shows how COVID dominated thinking in July. Less so in November. Now, a surprising finding was that our index of social cohesion, and these are index points, these numbers represent index points, and they're benchmarked against the 2007 survey, which is 100. So we benchmark against the notional 100 in 2007. And surprisingly, between 2019 and 2020, it moved in a positive direction. And in November, it further moved in a positive direction. So this is quite surprising. This actually was the reason that this foundation, Scanlon Foundation, decided that they should do another survey in November just to make sure that there was not something funny about the numbers. Now, I looked around and tried to see, are there other attempts at an index that might have shown a similar result? And the Australian Unity Wellbeing Index also moved in a positive direction between 2019 and 2020. And when that was released late in the year, the researchers commented, as we did, that they were surprised by this result. Ipsos has an index conducted in 27 countries, and Australia ranked fourth in their index of 27 countries and first in terms of developed economies. So there's a consistency in these findings. And the challenge then is to try to make sense of it. Well, why did this happen when in many senses we were experiencing a period of crisis? Some would say, unprecedented for 100 years in terms of the health challenge. When we look further into the index, we find that the index moved in a positive direction in the domains of social justice, which measures people's trust in government and whether people think there's enough support being given to those in low incomes. And then the index of acceptance rejection, which was stable in July, moved in a positive direction in November. And that again was something of a surprise. So I'm going to be trying to unpack these findings as I go through the presentation. So despite the level of economic dislocation, there's a surprising finding that more positive responses were obtained for a number of questions on personal financial circumstances. The proportion who lost their jobs or were working fewer hours or no hours was very substantial. See, just 67% indicated in July that they were working the same hours as before. And in November, a bit better, 27%. So evidence of substantial dislocation and a particular impact on young people. So if we just look at people who lost their jobs, close to 1 in 5 young people, 18 to 24 years old, who'd been working lost their jobs, compared to 6% and 4% to older age groups. Working the same hours, less than half of the young people in July were working the same hours, and in November, 47%, compared to like 2 out of 3, and then 3 out of 4 of those aged 25 to 64. So the survey findings certainly bear out the economic impact and the disproportionate impact on young people. Now, these questions about financial satisfaction and circumstances, people indicated that they were more satisfied in July than they had been the previous year. And that number was still basically maintained in November. And the proportion who said that they were poor, struggling, were just barely getting along, you see, it was 42% in 2018, 39% in 2019, and that had gone down in 2020. Now, perhaps the level of government financial support, which obviously wasn't received by everybody, but those who received it, did have a positive impact in the short term. And there were other surveys that had got similar results. The ANU group had been conducting surveys, and they also found similar results. People living on low incomes receive enough financial support from the government. You see, that jumped from 40% in 2019 to 55% in July 2020. Gone down, but was still at 49% in November, which was still higher than in previous years. However, young people, again, when we look at these questions and just look at the 18 to 24-year-olds, their level of positive agreement is lower. So agreement that there's enough financial support, 44% amongst the youngest group, and you can see close to 60% for those aged 25 and above, up to the age of 54. and optimism for the country's future, all other groups, it's 70% or above. And for younger people, it's 58%. So there's certainly a clear pattern here. One aspect which I won't have time to discuss today is that even though young people are disproportionately affected, they remain still the most positive with regard to cultural diversity, immigration, multiculturalism. So that doesn't feed into then a negative attitude towards a whole broad range of issues, but it's the economic circumstances that are highlighted. All right, democracy. What happens with democracy in the context of the pandemic in Australia? And I think Australia here is quite different to a number of other countries. England, the United States, I think were fractured in a way prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic in some respects than Australia. In England, because of the continuing debates about Brexit, and in the United States, in the context of the presidency of Donald Trump. I don't think that characterised Australia. As I interpret it, the key to positive findings appears to be the level of trust in government. The widely held view that effective leadership was being provided, including financial support to those who lost their jobs and whose businesses had been impacted. And again, I make the point, I realise not everybody received that support, but substantive proportion of the population did. So let's look at some of these findings. One of the questions we've been asking since 2007 is, how often do you think the government can be trusted? This is the government in Canberra. And I'm showing you here the top two responses, most of the time and almost always. Now that level, the long-term level of trust in Canberra is about 1/3, 32, 33%. And you see what happened in 2020. It went from 33 in 2019 to 49 in both surveys so it's actually 54. If we add almost always or most of the time, we get 54% as opposed to 36% in 2019. Now, they're the highest proportions indicating trust in government since the surveys began. It was the first time that a majority indicated that you can trust the government in Canberra most of the time or almost always. Would you say the system of government we have in Australia is works fine or needs minor change? Now, in 2019, if we add those two together, we get 62%. In July, that's gone to 69%. And in November, it's gone to 72%. So 72% in November saying that the government system either works fine or just needs minor change, as opposed to major change or should actually be got rid of and something else take its place. And then we say, how well is the federal government responding to the COVID pandemic? And we're getting very well or fairly well in July at 85%. Now you understand 85% is a pretty extraordinary number. If governments are getting 53% support, they think they're doing okay. And here we've got 85%. Even in Victoria, Victoria had the worst COVID outcome, large number of deaths, and an extended period of lockdown. Now, do you think the lockdown restrictions were required? Because we've got any number of people in the media saying this was a mistake, they were not required. So this is what the population thinks on that issue. 63% definitely required, probably required 24%, total 87%. Western Australia in these indicators was scoring 99% approval of the government action. And I think you know what happened in the last West Australian election. the government in power, the Labor government, basically won nearly all the seats. The Liberals are, I think, won 2 seats, and the Nationals, last I saw, had won 4 seats, total of 6. Like the Liberals can actually have a meeting over coffee, down at the coffee lounge, because there's only 2 of them left. They don't have to worry about booking a room. And I think this is important because it shows that what the population looks for first and foremost is for resolute government action to control the pandemic. And they just have to watch the nightly news, morning news, just to see what is happening in countries which have not controlled the pandemic. Just one last indicator, positive view of government in international surveying, and these surveys are conducted in each of these countries. See, Australia is near the top in the level of positive valuation of government, compared to, you see, USA and UK down the bottom, getting half the level of approval almost that Australia is receiving. All right, so another question that was certainly top of my mind was, in the period of crisis, do people turn on each other? In the period of the Great Depression, there was heightened xenophobia, heightened attack on minorities, raising barriers to international trade and so on. So was there a movement in support of such responses in Australia? And the finding is that neither in July nor November is there indication of heightened support for raising barriers and closing Australia to the world. A substantial majority of survey respondents continue to endorse open trade, immigration, and multicultural policies. And just to give you some indication, these are some general statements about, say, multiculturalism and immigration. And you can see that the positive responses are in the range 80 up to 90%. So someone born outside Australia just as likely to be a good citizen, 90%. Multiculturalism has been good for Australia, 84%. And you see they're actually higher than they were in 2018 and 2019. Immigrants are generally good for the economy, 76, 81, amazing numbers. Immigrants improve society by bringing new ideas and cultures, 78 to 82. So, I think there's a positive story that comes out of this. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of positives that come out of Canberra. And we can just see the sort of the current problems. And yet these are the sort of numbers that we were getting in 2020. When we ask about the impact of immigration, for example, immigrants take jobs away, which I think is a key question in the way that people appraise immigration. 64% agreed with that in 2019, 70% in July, 71% in November, disagreeing that immigrants take jobs away. All right, so that part of the presentation is the good story. Now let's look at the data in a bit more detail. And it's probably less positive, but not hugely less positive, maybe hugely less positive. Let's look at it. So the qualification is that when Australians say that multiculturalism is good, they don't mean, and I think our surveys established that, they don't mean that what's good is that we're going to have a flourishing of a whole range of different cultures in this country. More what is meant is that people are integrating and multicultural policies help them integrate. People accept, our surveys would indicate, as Australian-born people accept that they have to adjust. They have to learn and accommodate to, and in a positive sense, to new cultures and new peoples. But they also very strongly support the requirement that immigrants also once being in Australia, integrate, learn about Australian customs, etc. So when we ask a question like too many immigrants not adopting Australian values, 60% agree with that proposition. Interestingly, lower than 2019, but still 60%. And should ethnic minorities be given government assistance to maintain customs and traditions? And a majority disagree with that. Only a minority support that. It's really hard to find a demographic in our surveys where you get a majority support for immigrants to maintain their customs and traditions with government funding. You know, the only demographics would be those under the age of 24. And even there, it might be very close to 50-50, and Greens voters. But no other demographic that I can think of that would support that proposition. So then what do we have? We have strong support for the open society, the ideal of the open society, strong support for multiculturalism, but as a way of helping immigrants integrate into Australian society. Acceptance of the idea that Australians have to change. But I think, you know, brackets, not too much change. I think that's how, as I interpret it, the data plays out. And there's this underlying concern with racism in Australian society, which is seen not by a majority, but by a substantial minority as a big problem. You know, around 40% agree that during the pandemic, racism was a very big or fairly big problem. So let's go further to unpack this. So alongside the positive findings, there's evidence of a relatively high level of negative opinion towards Australians of Asian, African, and Middle Eastern background. And also high levels of concern we find in our surveys within the Asian Australian population. But, and this is quite important, where identical question wording allows for comparison of 2020 results with those of earlier surveys, we don't pick up a substantial jump in negativity. It's pretty much at the level that it was in previous years, as far as we can determine from surveying. Now, that may not be the whole story, probably isn't the whole story, but all I can do is present to you the findings that we've been able to come up with. But just one other important point before I go on. What we have in Australia is a hierarchy of ethnic preference. And when you ask people, what do you think about this group, that group, there's a clear hierarchy. That's probably true of every society. It's not something that is sort of, you know, white Anglo-Saxon societies. It's not necessarily just a feature of European society. If we look at Asian societies, African societies, and so on, my understanding, we can discuss this later, but this ethnic preference hierarchy seems to be a constant, even though the hierarchy is not going to be the same in every country, obviously. All right, so let's look at the hierarchy. So what are your feelings? Are they positive, negative, or neutral towards specific groups? And you can see there that, you know, and these are the two surveys, pretty similar results. UK, Italy, Germany, negative sentiment is under 10%. USA is 18%, and that might be a Donald Trump impact. Why aren't they 9%? Because of the bad name that America had in some circles. But then Lebanon, China, Iraq, Sudan is clearly in the 40s. And this pattern is consistent with what we've got in earlier surveys as well. When we ask about attitude to faith groups, there's this high level of negative sentiment towards Muslim Australians. That hierarchy isn't quite as strong there. And interestingly, the Christian attitude towards Christians isn't the lowest in terms of negativity. And I think a number of factors explain that. When I've done focus group studies, in the context of Christians, and it was particularly a couple of years ago, the treatment of young people, the abuse of young people within certain Christian elements, obviously very much a minority, but that issue has impacted I think, on the reputation of Christians in our society. That was just one of many factors, Now, we disaggregate this data by birthplace groups. This question, how big a problem is racism? You see that amongst Asian-born respondents, they see this as a major problem, much more so than born in Australia. But even amongst those born in Australia, over one third think it's a big problem, close to 60% amongst Asian-born, slightly lower in November. Have you experienced discrimination? And again, it's consistent with our earlier surveys. The much larger proportion amongst Asian-born. And you might say, what about people from various African countries or the Middle East? Well, we didn't have enough survey numbers in our sample to be able to report those findings. Now, is there heightened negativity in 2020? And where we can actually benchmark the data, there isn't evidence of heightened negativity. If anything, even marginally lower. You can see that, for example, for the 4 groups where we've got comparable data from 2019, the 2020 levels are marginally lower rather than significantly higher in 2020. And this is if I was sort of graph it. So the alarming thing would be we'd see a spike, that the graph would go up in 2020, but it doesn't. Have you experienced discrimination? And if we just look at those born in Asian country over the last 12 months, again, there's no spike. So the last part is like, how do we decode these patterns? What's going on here? Evidence of positive, and then these qualifications. Can we sort of make sense of this? So the way I make sense of it is I think we have to focus not on the total population, but in that segment of the population with strong negative, we might say bigoted or racist views. And what proportion of the population is this? So for example, people who strongly disagree with multiculturalism, who strongly disagree with accepting immigrants from many different countries, who thinks we should be able to reject potential immigrants on the basis of race or religion. Go back to the White Australia days, as a not lamented former senator advocated from Queensland. And you can see about 4 to 6% of the population have strong negative views with response to these sorts of questions. A small minority. But the argument is that this small minority are the ones who may well be disproportionately online, spreading messages of negativity, and most likely, although I can't prove that, but more likely if you meet someone on the street, driving past them in your car, in a supermarket, who might actually shout out or say something derogatory. Not the whole population, but I think that the people with strongly negative views, 4 to 6%. And when we look at specific attitude to specific groups, Muslims, Iraqis, people from a Chinese background or perceived to be of a Chinese background, the people with strong negative views with regard to this segment of our questionnaire is higher. It's around 17% to 13%, depending on the group. So nearly 1 in 5, 1 in 6. So if we then sort of try to make sense of the trend, the balance of Australian opinion, the core of people with bigoted attitudes, it might be 4 to 8%. If we bring into account attitudes to outgroups, people from Asia, Africa, other countries who in the ethnic hierarchy are at the pointy end, we combine core and the view of outgroups, we're getting towards 20%. And then there's another segment of the population, depending on the question. For example, the question about concern about lack of integration, that we can add another 10 to 35% depending on the groups. But I think it's important to get this balance right and to understand it. And to understand, for example, the people who are tending negative are the ones who may well actually be amenable to having different views in different circumstances. And various campaigns like Racism It Ends With Me and so on, some of those campaigns, I think, are more likely to have impact amongst that larger amorphous group than amongst the core. And really the last slide is this, it's the reach of social media. Like, have you seen racist content in the last 3 months on Facebook? And 3/4 of women aged 18 to 24, who more likely to be users of social media, a platform like Facebook, more women than men, Twitter, more men than women. So social media has given a platform where people can hide and spout out horrendous viewpoints for all to read. And this is like a major problem, I think, for our societies. And I think we all recognize this going forward. All right, so 2020 in perspective. And this is my summary page. In terms of personal financial circumstances, surprisingly more positive than in 2019. Very high levels of endorsement of government, high levels of trust. Also, personal trust went up. I haven't had time to look at that. But when we ask people, do you think most people can be trusted or you can't be too careful? Prior to the pandemic, it was something like 42-57, 42% saying you can trust, 57% saying you can't be too careful. And that was reversed. So a majority came to endorse the view that you can trust most people. But then we've got these relatively high levels of negative opinion and also reported experience of discrimination, heightened levels of concern. So although not without qualification, the substantially positive attitudes identified in this survey provide evidence of a strong, cohesive and resilient society. And I think one proof of that is that a society which is not cohesive cannot control a pandemic because people don't do what the government asks them to do. And we've got evidence of that in many countries where people flouted the requirements or there was sufficient groundswell of opinion that governments didn't act. And Australia is clearly not in that category. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I, for one, found that fascinating. And I guess I've got a question. We will open up for questions, and we've got quite a few that have come through. But you mentioned social media and platforms like social media. What is, from your opinion, the future? What is the impact of social media do you perceive in the future, and its impact on social cohesion?
Well, I think it's really another example, and there's a few of them around where the government dropped the ball, where basically free rein was given to service providers and is being given to some extent to service providers, basically to maximize their profits. And maximizing their profits means, getting people engaged, talking and so on, going online so that they can actually be exposed to advertising. And, I think there would be agreement that the government still have not really got this situation under control. That the attitude is really leave it to private enterprise to work that one out. And I think it's only in recent times that been a more serious attention devoted to that, but I think still a long way to go. You know, and there's so much evidence of the horrendous damage that can be caused, particularly in the context, say, of spreading all sorts of lies, misinformation. How, like, you know, a significant section of the American population was convinced that the election was stolen. You cannot have a functioning democracy if the level of irrationality that's allowed to be sort of promulgated across society is unchecked. And, like, you know, I actually can't stand social media and I stay clear of it. So I have to be, there's no shortage of people around me who can tell me what's going on. And I haven't heard of many good stories.
Yeah. No, fair enough.
Yeah.
Related to that question, we have a question here that asks, do good news stories promote a more positive narrative and acceptance of migrants and refugees? So I suppose looking on the flip side, does that make a difference?
Well, I think it does make a difference. But the problem is that good news stories don't seem to sell. You know, we emphasize the negative and the salacious aspects that grab people's attention. You know, what sells newspapers is Meghan Markle and Harry and what they're up to. Yeah. And you try and put in a story about how, say, in the tremendous contribution that immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees make to our society, and see how much airtime you're going to get on that one. Yeah, because I don't think it's a sort of a, we have to be clear about prejudice and bigotry and be clear that there's some people that you can talk to and other people you can't talk to. And that was the point of my circles, to try to actually be able to target our messaging to those who have the capacity to listen and to hear, and not to waste our effort targeting messaging to those who have got totally shut minds and they're not open to anything.
Yeah.
But I think we've seen how, like, some positive stories can actually have, I think, a very positive impact on people's perceptions, like the examples of the bushfire period, and, you know, how various immigrant groups got out there and tried to do what they could to, you know, help the firefighters and feed them and so on. We've got other aspects, like, you know, here in Melbourne, Basher Hooley is a sort of like a major figure. He's an Australian rules football player, Muslim background, you know, a devout practicing person of the Muslim faith who just does so much for the community. So these positive stories in the mainstream, but the problem that we have is that newspapers are financial entities. They have to make money. And, you know, if you want to be a budding journalist and you want to get your stories clicked, what sort of stories are you going to write? I was told, you know, at one of the presentations that I'd given this a few years ago, that, you know, that the saying was that stories to do with, you know, accidents and, you know, people being injured and so on, that grabs people's attention. You know, people being evicted from their houses, people in financial circumstances, people swindling other people of money. These are things that attract people, not the positive stories.
Yeah, an ongoing challenge, I suppose, but we need to keep those positive stories coming, like you said, to try to sway the middle, you know, towards more positive outlooks and attitudes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. We've got quite a few questions here that are to do with the sample, so I might just go through them one by one. So the first question is, what are the demographics of the sample, and do they differ at all from previous years? So I think you touched on this, but if you can just provide a bit more background, that would be great.
That's great that that question was asked, because there's a risk that too often you just look at the numbers and you don't look how the numbers were sort of, got together and so on. So another way to actually get a lot of media attention is to come out with surveys with sensationalist findings, like 90% of Australians are racist. That's going to grab attention. If we say 90% of Australians actually cope quite well with, pandemic and helped each other and so on, that's much less interesting than 90% of Australians are racist. So then that one, you'd actually want to look at the sample and how it was obtained. So it's not an easy matter to get a representative sample. It's not easy because some of the groups that you most likely want to survey don't want to be surveyed. Yeah. So say in the Australian milieu, given the nature of reporting over the last few years and so on, if you wanted to go and survey a Muslim population, you'd have great difficulties. Even if you had the goodwill of the leaders of those communities, and it was all shared and it was cooperative and so on, it would still be very difficult. If you wanted to do a serious survey in some of the, in surveying, that's called rare populations. If you want to survey a rare population, rare meaning hard to get at, it's really like a 3-year project rather than just hopping out with a questionnaire and saying, would you answer that for me, please? Yeah. So another problem in surveying is that traditionally the way that people would get a sample would be by ringing people up. You get the telephone directory, it was electronic form, you randomly generate numbers and you start ringing people. The problem with that is people look at their phones and they say, who's this from? I don't know that person, I'm not going to answer it.
Yeah, we've all done that.
So, in surveying now by telephone, if you ask 100 people, 6% is likely to answer the phone and do the survey, 6%. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can get around that by, say, giving people money, financial incentives. Do this survey, we'll give you $50. But the problem is that the people who say yes to that, are they representative of the population or not?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So that said, the Social Research Centre, which is, in my view, the leading sort of serious survey group in Australia. It's actually a business, it's a subsidiary of the Australian National University now. So it's kept to very high standards. They've constructed a panel. So a lot of the surveying is now done by panels. People are asked to join a panel. So there's commercial panels which have like 1 million people on it or 100,000 people. And they will then survey their own panel. And they'll survey it in such a way that they get the right number of men and women, etc., different educational levels, income levels, and so on. But the problem with those panels is that people volunteered to join the panel. They weren't recruited on a random basis. Yeah. So there's one panel in Australia which was recruited on a random basis. Some of it was by address-based sampling. So people got a letter in the mail saying that we're establishing this panel, part of the Australian National University. It's a very serious enterprise and so on. So there's that panel, which is called the Life in Australia panel. And the Life in Australia panel is balanced. So it has the right number of men, women, country people, city people. All of those demographics are well represented in the survey. Yeah. And so that's how our surveys are conducted. Typically, a survey might only need 1,500 people to be representative of the Australian population.
Yeah.
But our surveys are around 3,000, double that size. So when we disaggregate the survey by the various demographics, we still have consistent and reliable data. So I hope that sort of makes sense to people. We're basically doing the best possible surveys that you can in this country.
Yeah.
Short of having like $2 million to spend on the survey. Because if you had that, you'd have people knocking on people's doors, with various sort of explanations and so on. Sure. But if you don't have $2 million to conduct a survey, and there's probably better things to do with your money, then I think we do very well. It's not cheap, but by using that Social Research Centre panel, I think we get really good numbers in terms of reliability.
Yeah, and representation as much as possible as well. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. Thanks.
But you know, it's really difficult to reach some of those hard to reach populations. So if you say, well, why aren't there African respondents in our survey? Because you couldn't do that in a general survey because you don't pick up enough numbers. You would have to have a special survey for that purpose, which we have done in the past and doubtlessly will do it in the future.
Well, this kind of relates to the next question is, were people with limited English able to participate in this survey? And then it goes on to ask, I wonder if many newly arrived people with limited English have been able to be included, but I think you provided a bit of an explanation of the challenge around that.
Yeah, so the point here is this is a population of the Australian population. Yeah, so what we're trying to do is to understand the balance of opinion across the Australian community. And say people who are newly arrived or asylum seekers, if you think what proportion of the population are they? And they would be less than 5% of the population. So you're not going to get reliable numbers for those groups in a general survey. But I should say that the Social Research Centre is engaged in a project where they're seeing, can we actually establish a panel of people who don't have good English, who are recently arrived, etc., because that's a vitally important component of the population to be able to better understand. But bear in mind that it's very difficult because often if people are recently arrived, they don't want to be surveyed. You know, like if they're asylum seekers or refugees, they don't want to be surveyed. Why don't they want to be surveyed? Because they don't trust surveys. They're worried that if they give truthful answers and so on, this could actually have their chances of getting permanent residence impacted and so on. So it's easiest to survey general populations, which is what we do. To survey these so-called rare populations of great interest, it's very difficult. And it's not even just a question of money. It's a question of trust and buy-in. And with some of these groups, there has not been, in the last 10 years, good surveys, not because people haven't tried, but people have tried. But even when the leaders in these communities will say, people that trusted do this survey, it's still very difficult and understandably difficult for people who've come to Australia in difficult circumstances to be bothered and to see the value of doing surveys.
Absolutely. You mentioned asylum seekers, so I'll take that as an opportunity to ask the next question. Were there any questions in the survey that looked specifically at perceptions of asylum seekers by the general public? If so, what were the findings?
Yep. There was one question. You know, the asylum issue isn't like a hot topic issue in the context of the pandemic because immigration has stopped, including anybody, sort of population movements have basically been halted in a very large extent. We know that even Australians have been stranded overseas for a long time and still can't get back into Australia because of the restrictions. All right, so with regard to asylum seekers and attitudes, this again is like a contentious topic because there are different surveys with different findings. Our findings indicate that the general population, and there are other surveys as well, so I want to make this qualification, so don't just take it from me, yeah, do indicate that while there's strong support for refugees and a humanitarian program, it's a minority position that will support boat arrivals, etc. So I think that my interpretation is the Australian public looks to government for leadership. They provided that leadership in the context of the pandemic so that they got very positive numbers there. Whenever we've had elections in 2020, I think I can say that the government in power got re-elected. That's Queensland and Western Australia. and both in states where they were both Labor governments, so there was a bit of a hurdle to overcome to get re-elected, and they did both get re-elected. So I think that people look for government. While there's very positive attitude, I think, for the humanitarian program, my interpretation is that does not extend to undocumented arrivals or boat arrivals, and that the bulk of the population look for government to get on, control that program. So that the Abbott government, for example, when they basically halted boat arrivals, in our surveying had strong backing.
Yeah, thanks.
But, you know, don't lose sight of the qualification that there's strong support for the humanitarian program. But that's distinguished from, and it doesn't necessarily have to be distinguished, but in the minds of many people, the majority, I would say, it is distinguished between a refugee program where people are recruited and people who are undocumented arrivals.
And I think a point that you made before is, you know, the impact of the media and, you know, social media as well, and creating that distinction and that story of, you know, there's good news stories for refugees, but anyone who's come by boat, they're not welcome, they're, you know, jumping the queue, all that, that negative narrative around that. Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Mindful of the time, and we've got quite a few questions, but I'll just pick one. So this question is, you mentioned about the Australian values, but where were Australian values drawn from? Whose culture was other cultures subjected to in order to answer? So was it from an Anglo perspective, Indigenous? Yeah, the term Australian values, I suppose.
Yeah. Yep. So this is also a question that does come up from time to time. So again, bear in mind that what we're doing is we're surveying the population, the Australian population, not segments of the Australian population, although we get insights into segments where we can. Yeah. And an interesting question, which we've had in the survey from the beginning, is about the Australian way of life. Yeah. Now, for many people, that's very problematic. Like, what is the Australian way of life? Yeah. So one of the questions is, do you take pride in the Australian way of life? And another question we have is, do you think it's important to maintain the Australian way of life in the modern world? Yeah. And with these questions, we're getting around 90% affirmative. 90% of people say it's very important or important to maintain the Australian way of life. Now, if that was a question that didn't make sense to people, yeah, because you could well imagine that we could get a room full of people, I give them that question, the Australian way of life, and they say, well, we can't answer that. Tell us what the Australian way of life is. Well, don't waste our time. And the way that that plays out in the survey is if it doesn't make sense to people, you know what happens? They don't answer it. Yeah. So we got a don't know response or a refused response. And that can be 20% or 30% if it doesn't make sense to a lot of people. It's negligible.
Sure.
So I think that within the mainstream, the notion of the Australian way of life still has purchase and makes sense to people. And they do believe that it's something that we want to preserve.
Yeah. No, excellent. Thank you, Andrew. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today and presenting the summary of the findings. I think, you know, we can all read the report and it's a fantastic report, but sometimes having it being brought to life by the senior research just really makes a whole lot of difference. So really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Amanda.
And thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. We'll see you next time. And yeah, thank you so much again, Andrew, and look forward to seeing what the future of this survey and research holds and more to come from it. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye. Be well. Bye.